Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for a Learning Growing webinar on Make Workshopping Work, Writing Feedback for Growth and Asynchronous Classes. Our presenter today is Megan Kuyat of Anne Arundel Community College. My name is Sidra, and I'm going to be your moderator for today for Hawks Learning. We will have a live Q&A session at the end of the presentation, so if you want to enter any questions you have into the Q&A module or in the chat feature, both would work. And if you put them in as we go, we'll be sure to answer them at the end. I'll now hand it over to our presenter.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me, and welcome everyone. I'm excited today to be talking about workshopping. So my name is Meg Eden Kuyat. I'm a creative writing instructor at Anne Arundel Community College and also creative writing centers at large. And I'll talk a little bit more about the context for workshopping today and my background with that. But today we're going to talk about making workshopping work, writing feedback for growth in asynchronous classes. So yeah, like I said about me, I teach typically creative writing, but as well English 101 and rhetoric courses with workshopping components. I'd love for you to share about yourself. Feel free to share about yourself in the chat. Let me know what you teach and maybe how or where are you implementing or interested in implementing workshops. And a reminder again that anytime, yes, please feel free to ask any questions. I want this to be conversational, so you can put those into the Q&A chat. I know we have a short time today, so if there's any questions we don't get to today, you are always welcome to contact me at my site, megedenbooks.com. So just a little bit of context for us to get started. So when I'm talking about workshop, I'm really talking about students sharing work with their peers and instructor, getting feedback, and discerning how to use that feedback as they revise. So the workshopping model is all about presenting your work, getting feedback from your readers, and then deciding based on if that feedback is helping you with your work and what you're trying to achieve or not, how to revise and continually revising your work. The goal of a workshop is to help one another. It's a communal process. It's a continuous process. This is something we do typically multiple times in a semester. And so we really try and model to students that the writing process is one that is fluid, where we don't have this perfect work. We're continuously seeking how to make it better, especially because I think our culture, obsession with grades and perfection makes students come into classes thinking they have to create a perfect work. They have a lot of anxiety about writing and producing a product and making sure it's right and that it's exactly what the instructor wants, that the instructor's happy with it. So we really try and stress with workshop that the writing process is one where we are continuously revisiting this and continuing to grow, myself included as an instructor, as a writer. Workshop is a temperature check for the author. It's supposed to help them to figure out what the piece is doing on its own. So the context with workshops, the context I'm using workshops are for English 101, so rhetoric and composition, as well as English 200, Intro to Creative Writing, as well as other poetry and fiction courses. That said, I would argue that workshops can really be implemented in just about any course with written products. My bias is going to be as a creative writer, but maybe you have a science class and you're writing reports or other things like that. This can still be a helpful task just to get a sense of what's happening on the page and what can be clarified or improved. Today, I'm going to focus on workshops in the context of asynchronous courses. These have unique concerns with the workshop model. They might be particularly difficult to implement, but it's still a great environment for workshopping, and especially because asynchronous, you've got students coming in on and off all the time. This may be a way to kind of build community and engagement with your students. So benefits of workshopping. I am a pro workshopping. I think it's a valuable model for young writers. Or really just any writers, honestly, no matter where you are in the writing process. I think the benefits are, one, as I've kind of said, this is where you get to hear what your work is doing on the page for your audience. So when I am creating a workshop for my students, I'm trying to encourage them that this is a space where they can see what is happening on the page. And maybe by hearing what the audience is interpreting from that, they realize, oh, that's not what I'm trying to do, but they can learn from what they're hearing how to better clarify what they are trying to do. So you're getting that feedback, you're getting it outside of your perspective. So whenever we write, we're writing from our perspective, we're writing from the way we view the world. Workshop ideally is a space where we can hear how other people interpret what we're doing, other people seeing gaps that maybe we don't see. It helps us get outside of our frame of mind. Workshopping is also really great because it demands, when effectively done, that we're listening, absorbing, and avoiding a defensive response. We can have a little bit of time to have conversation about the way the workshop model works, of whether the person being workshopped can speak or not. But I think the value in not letting them speak during the workshop is that typically, if we are allowed to speak, we're going to try and defend our work. We're going to try and explain our work. And the workshopping process ideally discourages this, making us have to let the work stand on its own. It makes us have to listen to what others are saying. Workshopping is really great in allowing for collaboration. When we set up a workshop, I really try to encourage that we're all here to help one another. This is symbiotic and it's collaborative. So you're helping your peers by giving feedback. They're helping you by giving feedback. You can ask questions to each other. You can seek clarity, can learn from each other. This is the best way a workshop works, is when we're all learning from one another. Another thing that's valuable about workshopping is dismantling this idea of writing for your professor, or writing the right or wrong answers for your professor. In a good workshop, I encourage students to not necessarily use all the feedback, not necessarily plug in all the feedback that they receive, but instead discerning what feedback's helping you achieve what you're trying to do, what feedback is maybe going to distract what you're trying to do. So at the end of a semester with workshopping, I usually require my students to write a reflection about the process. What feedback did you use and why? What feedback did you maybe discard and why? Because this is how it works in the real world as a writer. People are going to be reading our work. They're going to give opinions. Sometimes their opinions are helpful. Sometimes their opinions aren't. And so setting them up to understand this idea that just because people say something about their work doesn't mean it's right, is helpful. At the same time, encouraging them to not be defensive and ignore all the feedback, some helpful in between grounds. So let me unpack a little bit this idea of the model of the real world. Our work is going to go out to readers that lack our context, who may not interpret our work the way we intend. So workshops ideally preparing us for this reality, whether this is, academic writing and we're entering an academic conversation, or creative writing where we might have, novelists or readers of our novels or our poems interpreting our work. And readers may not always get what we're trying to say yet. So when our writing's going out into the world, editors are going to ask for edits, peer-reviewed journal editors, are going to ask for edits. They may understand our vision or not. So in a good workshop, ideally, we're teaching students to identify their vision. What are they trying to say? What are they trying to achieve? And listening to feedback to discern if that's going to help that vision or distract it. A good workshop is about empowering the writer to become even stronger. So on that note of empowerment, I think in the benefits of writing, or workshopping, we need to also address some of the concerns about workshopping. There are a lot of valid concerns in conversations about the pedagogy of workshopping and the ways it's flawed potentially. So this is a really brief coverage of, these ideas. We could probably talk all day about concerns about the workshopping model, but I at least want to, address some things that we want to keep in the back of our mind when we're doing a workshop. So first off, a concern is that everyone basically has a negative workshop experience. Maybe a peer that just was really scathing in their feedback, or honestly, an instructor is usually the most traumatic experience. We often have peers that say things that are maybe annoying in workshops, but if an instructor is tearing down our work or questioning our work, that's something we probably are going to carry with us. I know I carry my negative workshop experiences with me, and those have made me stumble and stammer at times of going like, what am I doing with this writing thing? And so this is a valid concern. We don't want to discourage our students. We want to empower and encourage them to grow as writers. So it's important that we acknowledge this concern about harsh feedback, peers and readers that are not understanding what a writer is trying to do. Maybe a negative workshop experience is feeling silenced or misunderstood by this process, that you were vulnerable and you shared something that you worked really hard on and people, didn't respond or misunderstood. But again, I think the worst is when the instructor, is making the writer question their work and abilities. So there's a negative experience, but there's particularly this concern about a dominant perspective, and this concern about silencing a minority experience that can happen in a workshop. Often, especially if we have predominantly white, neurotypical male perspectives from either instructors or what's being read in the classroom, or just, the demographics of the classroom at large. If a student is the single minority in a workshop and they are writing with my experience, parts of their lived experience as a minority or their perspective as a minority, but there's this dominant perspective of white students or teachers or ideology in a classroom, this may make them feel invalid or that they have to write from a perspective of whiteness. Felicia Rose Chavez talks about the invisible politics of power and privilege in a classroom. So this is obviously relevant no matter what classroom, but particularly in a workshop. We may think this is a democratic process. I know I definitely, whenever I'm doing a workshop, I'm really seeking for it to be as democratic as possible, that we're all sitting in a circle, that all our points are at, each voice is equal in power, but this isn't necessarily true, even if that's idealizing. That's why I idealize and what I hope and strive for. There can still be these implicit biases and subconscious biases in what we're talking about with the work, how we're viewing the work, what we're perceiving as good or bad in a work. So for fiction, for example, I think about how a Western storytelling really privileges plot and action and characters being active. And storytelling from other cultures don't necessarily have active protagonists and characters making choices. And so we may unintentionally, make a student question their storytelling if they're carrying from a different tradition and a tradition that values different things than we do. What's particularly troubling is that, students may feel like the space isn't safe. They may feel discouraged or not empowered in a workshop. And I guess I mentioned this, the implicit pressure to write white neurotypical experiences, maybe thinking that their experience, whether in creative or academic writing, isn't valid or real writing. And so those things keep me up at night as an instructor. My desire is for my workshop to be safe for everybody, but I know that there are certain biases and privileges I carry into the workshop. And so I'm constantly trying to examine this process and trying to learn and grow in how to do this better. I think this is something that it's great for us to have like a webinar on this and to have conversations about the workshopping model, because I think there's so many great things about this, but there are still concerns and things that we can keep doing better. And we need to keep that in mind as we're deciding how to run a workshop. Let's see, how are we doing with questions? Okay, yeah, please feel free to put any questions in the Q&A as Thank you, Siri. Please feel free to put any questions in the Q&A at any point in time, of course. So, okay, and anything that you want to go further on at any point in time. So we've looked at some of the things that are great about workshopping models, some of the things that might be concerns with the workshopping model. And so now I want to go into a little bit about things that I would say I think are needed to make a workshop a success. And, I would love to hear in the chat if you have things too that you think, if you run workshops that you think help make them a success, please feel free to share those as well. But here's a few things that came to mind for me. So I think the first thing to make a workshop a success, especially in an asynchronous environment, it's really critical for that instructor to create the standards and expectations through modeling behavior, modeling tone, and establishing a safe space for your students from the get-go. And so in an asynchronous course, I think part of this is the material you deliver from the beginning. So if you're doing videos, how you talk to your students in that video. If you are writing, I tend to write a lot of text in my classes. The language and diction you're using, how you're engaging with your students, all of that's going to establish tone. Is it a friendly tone? Is it formal, informal? Is it standoffish? I've definitely had workshops where, the instructor was maybe kind, but there was still a lot of standoffishness that maybe made me feel not fully safe. So my tone, I tend to have a little bit more relaxed of an environment where we still have, rules and respect and boundaries, obviously, but I tend to try and establish an open tone, a friendly tone. I try to be open and vulnerable in a professional way, obviously, about the fact that I'm a writer. I'm struggling with this writing thing too. We're all, doing this together. When I try and ask questions, I try and provide assignments at the beginning, allowing students to share their work. All of these things can contribute to the tone and asynchronous course establishes. We're going to talk about tone more because I think this is one of the most critical things for an asynchronous course, but especially something like a workshop. And as I kind of implied again earlier, the times where a workshop is the worst, it's because of what the instructors did. The fellow peers, we can't, there's some things we can do to, encourage and discourage students and things like that. And there's often frustrating peers in a workshop. But when an instructor creates an environment with a negative tone and a not safe space, that's what really makes a workshop the most discouraging, and it really shuts down a student from writing. So this is particularly critical that we've got to make sure we set up through our behavior and tone a space where students can feel free to share. On that as well, I think we'll kind of talk about this more later, but what does it mean to establish a safe space? I think that this is something that's really nuanced that we could say a lot about, especially in asynchronous courses where there can be confusion in communication and things like that. One thing that I really try to do is make sure that there's multiple outlets and opportunities for students to share what they're thinking, reflect on how they're feeling with the course. So some of this may include, having assignments where students have to reflect on what's going on. And you can, quickly skim those as an instructor to see if there's anything alarming or troubling going on. Having office hours and one-on-one check-ins with students, maybe halfway through the semester where they can share. Maybe having a portal where students can specifically bring concerns anonymously if they're concerned. There's a lot of interactive ways that we can, invite student empowerment and for students to feel safe. And those are just some ideas. So first off, as instructors, we have to lead the way. The next thing is setting those clear expectations for how a workshop works in a structure. So I'm going to put this in the chat really quick. This is just an idea of a form. I usually have some sort of form, especially for beginning workshopees. And it's very simple, like the one attached, where they fill out, what are some things that are working well here? What are some things that are unclear? Or things that you'd like more of? Are there questions you have when reading this? So it's some really open-ended questions, but it establishes some expectations for the students of how they should be approaching a workshop, what sort of things they should be addressing when talking about a piece. And you can, add more structure if you want, but that's just an idea. Another thing is, I think a workshop really works when there's community. And this is obviously so much easier to establish when we're in person and we're seeing people. But this can to some degree still happen in an asynchronous course. And I think, again, so much of this is how the instructor kind of introduces the idea of a workshop, how an instructor explains the idea of a workshop, and how an instructor sustains a workshop. But I think especially, I know what resonated with me when I was starting out and taking workshops as a student was when teachers acknowledged, I don't know all the answers and I'm on this road with you. I'm a writer. I need feedback on my work. And kind of putting us on the same, a relatively similar playing field. The instructor's still the authority in the classroom, but the sense of like, oh, this isn't just because I'm a student that we have to do this. This is part of being a writer, that we're all learning, we're all in this together. And also the sense of symbioticness of, we need each other's feedback. We need each other to participate in this process because it's going to help you to get feedback. And when you have students reflect on the workshop process who maybe didn't do it before, almost always I have my students say, you know what, this was really helpful. When I got specific feedback, that helped me with editing my final portfolio or my final paper. But when people gave me vague feedback, that was not helpful. So it's clear through this process that students come to understand that the more specific they get, the more feedback that they get, that's going to be helpful for them as writers. And when they give specific feedback, they're helping their peers. And so if you put this energy into the process, you're going to get something out of it too. I've noticed that students respond to that sort of acknowledgement of the process and that sense of community. We'll talk a little bit more of ways that you can potentially develop community in an asynchronous course. Another thing I think is helpful for making a workshop work is, as an instructor, we're going to model, of course, also how we give feedback. So we give that structure, we establish tone, but then we're hopefully going to have some element of practicing workshops. I'll talk about that more, where you can model, this is how you give feedback. And when you give feedback, I think it's so important to have the mindset. I have to remind myself this over and over again, that every draft, every writer is bringing something valuable to the table, and every draft has something good in it. And sometimes that can be harder to find, especially if you're reading all these English 101 papers and you've got so many of them and you're just like, oh my goodness. But if you can identify the positives, that's going to empower a student. Every single student should have at least one thing where it's like, this is what you're doing well. Keep doing this. Do more of this. That is going to really drive a student. There is nothing more discouraging than getting feedback on your writing and everything's negative. That's a great way to shut down a new writer. That's a great way to shut me down as a writer. If you're giving me feedback on my manuscript and all you do is negative, I've had people do that. It is so discouraging. So if we are going in with the mindset of, when we are providing feedback, every draft is going to have a positive, we are modeling that to our students so they are also doing that. Frankly, when I have done workshops, especially at the community college level, I've had very few students that have been really negative. The vast majority have been really wanting to be positive, actually been a little scared to provide any feedback on things that could be improved. So I think students kind of know this, but if we're modeling that, I think it's going to really go a long way. So with that, I think another thing with the when we are examining a work in workshop, it's really important to focus on what is happening on the page now. It's really easy for us to assume what a writer's trying to do, and that this isn't working because this is chaotic or whatever. Maybe the writer is trying to create a chaotic experience. And so when we are asking questions instead of telling a writer what they should or shouldn't do, if we're saying, for example, maybe this current form does this for me as a reader. It's making me experience feeling overwhelmed and overstimulated. So if that's not the writer's intent, you may want to try a different form. That sort of thing where it's leaving it in the power of the writer's hands. We're empowering the writer by giving them that information of what this is doing now, and they can say, oh, great, that's exactly what I'm trying to do. So I'm going to keep that. Or maybe they go, I wasn't trying to create an overwhelmed feeling, so maybe I'll explore that form. A good workshop is empowering the writer to make choices. We are giving them information to help them make choices. So when we don't assume intent, when we just kind of give observations, when we ask questions, this is going to give them power. This is going to give them ideas to help them with what they are trying to do. This is, again, maybe a little bit more with establishing tone and what you're doing as an instructor, but I think it's important that we may mess things up in a workshop. We may make assumptions accidentally about a piece or a writer. We may just goof something up. We probably will, because we're humans. And so I think it's really important to model apologizing and learning and, taking accountability when we do mess up. And moving forward, modeling that to our students and having a relative sense of openness there, I think, is really valuable, that our students will appreciate. So some other things that are needed to make a workshop work, in my opinion, and maybe different parts of the process. So before we're workshopping, when we're first introducing a writing assignment, I think it's really important that we encourage all writers to mind the specificity of their lived experience. So this is applicable in creative writing, obviously. This is also applicable in academic writing. If we're writing about a book, there are still opportunities to integrate our lived experience and our perspective. And that's going to be our strongest writing. That's going to make that's going to make our arguments shine. That's going to make our writing pull readers in. And so I would argue probably for most subjects, there is some sort of space where we can integrate our lived experience. And that's valuable. And I think inviting students, giving them that invitation can really help some students who may be reluctant open up. When we're reading work, when we're reading a novel for an English class, when we're reading, short stories for a creative writing workshop, encourage us to explore diverse perspectives from diverse writers, modeling that there's a lot of different ways to approach writing and how these different approaches create different effects. This will allow our students to see the possibilities and different approaches that they can use in their projects. Then after the writing workshop, I think I kind of implied this with a safe space, but I think it's really important that we provide specific opportunities for the writer to speak up. So if we don't necessarily have them speak during the literal workshop, maybe at the end of the workshop, we can open for them to ask questions to those who were workshopping them. Maybe we give assignments where they can write out a reflection. Maybe we do individual conferences. I really value individual conferences for any asynchronous course, and I know that is a time-consuming ask as an instructor, but I think that this is just a really great way to give a human face for these students. So even if it's a 5 to 15-minute check-in for students that they can schedule, even during a class time. So sometimes maybe if I feel overwhelmed, I'll just have one class session where it's like, this is a working session. You're going to work on your papers, and I'm going to just, go into a breakout room and Zoom with you and just check in, bring your questions, and we'll talk for a couple minutes. And maybe I can get through most students during a class session. That's one way to realistically do this. But I think giving that face, giving that space for them to talk, not everyone's going to open up in that environment, but some students do. Some students, they do, or it helps them open up later in the course. So reflections, individual conferences, discussion forums, assignments where they have to, talk about what's been going on, what feedback they used, what they didn't. All of those are places where a student who maybe wouldn't take initiative to email you and express a concern or to express confusion. I've done the reflection thing, and some of the students that I thought were just, slacking off and, not engaged, they would say like, I have no idea what's going on and I'm so embarrassed. And that reflection created a space for them to be vulnerable so that we could identify the problem. I felt so mortified as the instructor, like I had no idea that I made assumptions about that student, and I feel awful about that. I'm grateful we had that space. So now I could intervene and go like, hey, here are some resources to help you with the things that are confusing you. Hey, let's talk about maybe some things that are confusing you. Let's break down the assignment a little bit more. That gave me tools as an instructor of how to help that student. So, every student's going to be different. Not all of them will resonate with these, but if you have different options for interactivity, especially in these asynchronous courses where it's really easy for students to just, fly under the radar, to not engage, creating these things where they have to engage, and where they have an opportunity to share concerns, questions, reflect on the process, that's all going to be really helpful for making the workshop work. So as I said, we're focusing on asynchronous today, but I did want to identify some of the kind of pros and cons of each course, because I think there are pros and cons with asynchronous workshops as well as in person. I think in person, and even Zoom, honestly, those are going to be a little different, but, when we're doing it real time, that's going to allow for conversation to be more fluid. So, maybe we go around, people make their observations of what's working well, then maybe they go around and give their observations of what's unclear or what questions that they might have while reading it. And then we can open up for a couple minutes for the author to ask questions to the readers. We can all do that in real time, and that's really valuable. When we're in person, I definitely have seen significantly more chemistry and community among the students. They really get to know each other better. Some of them become friends. You really feel this cohort and camaraderie. And so that's a really valuable thing about in person. But I think that there's also values with Zoom and asynchronous. I think a lot of students, especially for asynchronous, I have a lot of students that, maybe otherwise wouldn't be able to take that course, who have a lot of life commitments going on, and that flexibility of being able to submit their work when they're by the deadline, to be able to reflect and take time. That's valuable for them. I can say as a neurodivergent person, I've found asynchronous is really valuable for me because it gives me time to think. Maybe I don't know right away what to say in a workshop or what to say after receiving feedback, but that gives me some time, to process. So this can be, accommodation wise valuable, the asynchronous environment for folks that maybe would struggle, but more in a more traditional workshop setting. What's cool with asynchronous, while also maybe can potentially have some downfalls, is that the process of the workshop happens in steps. There's got to be provision for asking clarifying questions, because that can be a little bit more difficult than if you're having it real time. But it does potentially give time for students to reflect and absorb feedback. So I think asynchronous, as I said, is a really great place for having a reflection assignment of, maybe a week after their first workshop, just like a quick text thing of, how did you feel about that? What was it like having your work workshopped? What was scary about it? What was cool about it? Things like that, where they can just talk. When I've done reflections in person and asynchronously, I always encourage them for it to just be like, you're just chatting to me. Don't freak out about writing it perfectly or anything like that. Just talk to me. And that seemed to help students, open up a little bit more on the page. With asynchronous, as we've said, tone can be harder to reflect and interpret, and group cohesion can be a little bit more difficult. So because of that, I want to spend a little time talking a little bit more about tone, because this is just so critical for any asynchronous course. So tone obviously is easier to misinterpret when we're purely working on text. If people are writing out their feedback, you might go, oh, there might be some room for interpretation there. So when we're establishing tone, when we're modeling workshop, it's really important for us to focus on clarity of communication. We really want to model how to write precisely. When I'm talking to students about writing any kind of assignment online, I really stress to them, I personally, especially for the initial assignments, don't care too much about the grammar and syntax and stuff. Well, okay, grammar maybe and punctuation, surface things like that. That's valuable in the final product, but it's way more important that we have ideas clearly communicated before we get to that part. So if I'm struggling to understand because of punctuation and grammar issues, that's when I go in and say, at this point, it's making me struggle to understand what you're saying. And so it's really important. The ideas and communicating those ideas is what really matters. And so modeling that for students and having a structure to help them with that is really important. As we said, with modeling for the students, how we talk about workshop and why the heck we're doing this, focusing on this idea of helping each other. I think when we model feedback in our initial workshop, like our practice workshop or something like that, we show through the tone of how we talk about the feedback, of how this is, we can show that that's trying to help the writer with what they're trying to do on the page. We want to establish not just in the explanation of workshop, but in how class materials are written, how engagement and forums happen, et cetera. So I think I kind of talked about that earlier. Especially at the beginning of workshopping models, it's really important to at least glance at all the feedback that the students are providing. Maybe later in the semester, you don't necessarily have to look at every single thing that students are providing, but I think if you are able to, that's really good, especially to address any problematic comments. If something's coming off a little harsh, maybe reaching out to that student and be like, hey, the tone is maybe a little ambiguous here. Can you maybe clarify tone here? Or, and remember, we're trying to lift each other up, something like that. And often, like, I think maybe once or twice I've had to go to the student and go like, hey, this is a little unclear, or this is a little concerning. And like every time they go, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, it's not what I meant. So I think, at least in my experience, the students have largely understood this idea of trying to help each other, and they've desired to do that. So it's just kind of letting them know if you see something that could be of concern, they're likely to, be receptive to that. So I've said this of having a model workshop is really important and great. And there's really easy ways to do this in asynchronous. So for my initial workshops, often what I'll do is I will provide something short, like a poem or, a paragraph from an essay. And I will then write out what my feedback would be in a workshop. This is how I would fill out my feedback form for this piece. So they can see through how I'm writing it tonally, what to consider, and seeing, the specificity of comments. I'm not just going to say like, oh, I like how happy this is, or I think this is good writing, or something extremely vague. Maybe I go, this aspect, was really vivid for me, or something like that. That's this quote, this the way the writer describes being in the seats of a Steak and Shake is very vivid and specific. Something like that. I can model for the students what that looks like of providing feedback. So then once I've done that, then I give them a separate, essay, quote, or a separate poem, again, something short, as a quiz. And then I make like a workshop form in that quiz where they have to write, one or two things that they might say are working well, one or two things that are maybe a little unclear, or the writer could consider as they're revising. And so that the quiz is a really quick way for me to kind of glance and see if they're getting the vibe of what they're supposed to do. Or if I see concerns of, oh, this is, too brief and too vague, then I can talk to that writer and express concerns. So that's an easy way to do a model workshop where you're not, taking up a huge amount of time on your end. And of course it's graded. So, that's an assignment that they have to do for points. That can be a relatively easy way to integrate a model workshop. And as I said, in that sample feedback, you want to make sure you're showing specific ways that you can provide strengths as well as points of clarity. Two particular things that I make sure to stress with workshoppers is one, go beyond punctuation and grammar and those things. That's helpful to point out if, there's some errors, but that should not be, the main thing you're doing. We really want to focus on ideas and the conveying of ideas and the underlying argument. So that's really where you want to focus your feedback. I also discourage them from language of like, don't like, this is weak or bad. We definitely want to avoid just, unhelpful negative language. If you don't like something or you think something's bad, it's not really helpful. It's like, okay, well, what now? So instead we want to reframe language for growing. So when I'm workshopping and I'm trying to point out, the things to work on, I'm going to say, maybe this is a little unclear to me what this means, or this part could be made even stronger if you use sensory details. These abstractions are less powerful than if you were concrete and specific, or something like that. Maybe I'd love even more of. I really try and encourage, like, this is maybe unclear at this moment, yet this would be even stronger. I'd love even more of this. That kind of positive language is, it's not floofy positive language. It's focusing on constructive ways for the student to grow on the page, and things that they can really consider for revision, that give them a direction that they can consider, and really deciding, as we said, what sort of things would help clarify my vision and my intent for the piece. So I wanted to provide kind of a sample structure for an asynchronous workshop. You can, for online courses, have a synchronous workshop where you go on Zoom or something like that. I've tended to do an asynchronous workshop structure. So in this, there'd be a deadline for each student to post their work, and this would be in a forum. So maybe you do workshop groups and they each post on separate forums. Or you assign who's going to read whose pieces, or everyone reads everyone's pieces. It varies, but there's a specific place, usually a forum, where they would post by a certain deadline. Then students are going to read that work. They're going to maybe use the workshop form and write, their responses of what's working well, what's unclear. And by a deadline, they would post their feedback as replies to that initial form post. I will do that as well as an instructor. That is the most time-consuming part of my work, is providing individualized feedback for workshops, but I think it's the best way a student's going to grow. By getting that feedback, that's really how their writing's going to become stronger. I can talk till the cows come home, but unless I'm actually looking at their work, they're not going to be able to grow as much. So I also make sure I'm posting some feedback. Then after that, it's important to try and have some sort of space for clarifying questions or reflection for that writer. So this could be a quick Zoom check-in. This could be a reflection write-up. I always have that for their final portfolio, that they have to write a reflection on how they revised. What feedback did they consider? What did they not? Maybe even just a reflection about the workshop experience, questions on the feedback, some sort of space that you're creating for that to happen. And then, of course, we kind of briefly mentioned this. You have to decide in the workshop, how they get involved. I think asynchronous is really great in the sense, because I think if it's in Zoom or if it's in person, you have to kind of establish a rule of, the author doesn't talk while we workshop, or the author talks, and you have to kind of decide that. But in this space, it really makes them have to listen to what their peers are saying, because they have to kind of read the forms that are provided. But perhaps they should not be entirely quiet. I think maybe workshops where there's no space for a student to, ask follow-up questions are a little problematic. So because this is a model for the real world, but it's, they're not a published novelist reading Goodreads reviews, right? So having a little bit of space where they can, ask questions, maybe a separate forum, maybe one of these other ideas. But you kind of have to figure out for your workshop how you want to model that. And then, of course, I think in the workshop structure, it's critical to have some element of revision, whether this is revising every single project or, so usually for my courses, English 101, the second half of the course is really focused on a big paper, and they do a bunch of revising for that. For my English 200 and similar courses, often they create a portfolio where they pick a couple things they wrote and they revise those. But I would say that revising is what you're trying to get as the outcome of workshop. By getting that feedback, the point is so that they can revise it. And as I said, requiring a reflection so they can, not just passively do that, or just basically upload the exact same thing. They have to kind of walk through what they did in the revision. This is really important, and a great way for the students to really engage with this process, reflect on the process, and demanding them to do more than just change their punctuation or something much more surface level. Revision is about the idea is changing. So I kind of implied this idea of workshop groups. There's a lot of ways you can do asynchronous workshops. Typically, my asynchronous courses are relatively large for everyone to workshop each other's material. When you've got 15 to 25 students, that's asking a lot for the students. So I tend to create workshop groups. If this is on Canvas, under people, I can make different groups, and I tell them that's your workshop group. You workshop those people throughout the semester. And potentially I shift it halfway through. I used to do that. That's a lot of work. And it causes confusion for the students. So sometimes I'll do that if necessary, but often we'll just have a cohort where it's like you're 2 to 4 people that, you always workshop with. This can be valuable for group cohesion, community, and ideally quality feedback. If you're seeing concerns, maybe that's when you mix up the groups. But this can, you can encourage those groups for your workshopping, but also, maybe for other assignments where they can all work together. I've done wikis assignments where, those groups would provide their portion of the wiki together. Things like that are going to hopefully help create a little bit more community where those students, potentially will go to each other and work together. And so I actually have one more resource on here. I'll put that in the chat in a moment. These are 2 texts I'll just disclaim. I have not yet read them. I have heard great things about them, particularly for the creative writing classrooms. The Anti-Racist Writing Workshop, How to Decolonize the Creative Classroom by Felicia Rose Chavez, as well as Craft in the Real World, Rethinking Fiction Writing and Workshops by Matthew Salesses. Both of those are ones that I have frequently heard other writers, using instructors using for evaluating the pedagogy of their workshops. So I encourage you to check them out if those are relevant for what you're doing. They may be able to give you some cool ideas. I believe in the chat, yeah, I put the workshop form. I'm going to put one more, which is just kind of an approach, just a brief document approaching the workshop model that, is a quick read and maybe a helpful resource. But other than that, that's everything I wanted to cover. So we've got a bit of time for questions. I don't see any in the Q&A yet, but I'd like to invite you, if there's something you want clarity on that we talked about, if there's something we didn't talk about and you're like, I really want to talk about this regarding workshopping, please, this is a great time to put that in the Q&A. I'd love to talk more about all this stuff. I'm also going to put in the chat a link to my website. If there's any follow-up conversation you'd like to have, you're welcome to contact me through my website, and check out other things that I'm doing. But I think that is it. Yeah, no questions. Wow, okay. Yeah, any thoughts of things you're doing in your workshop that you'd like to share? That's also welcome. Well, I'm not seeing anything in the Q&A, so I'm thinking maybe we should start wrapping up.
Yeah, I think that's probably a safe bet. Well, thank you so much, Megan, for all of this information and all of the great resources, and thank you all for attending today. If you or any of your fellow instructors are interested in presenting for our Learning and Growing webinar series, please submit your proposals to the Learning and Growing website, which I'm going to go ahead and link in the chat now for easy reference. We will be emailing you a link to this recording of the webinar once it's available, and I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Bye.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close out the webinar. It was a pleasure meeting you and working with you as well.
Awesome. Thanks. Thank you so much for doing this. This
No
is cool.
problem. Thank you for all of the great information.
Oh, yeah. Have a good one.
You too. Bye.